The first time I read my own obituary, I was sitting in a coffee shop in Portland, sipping an overpriced latte that had gone cold 20 minutes earlier. My hands trembled as I scrolled through the article on my phone, published by the Cascade Tribune under the headline "Local Woman, 68, Succumbs to Illness." The photograph they'd used was from my daughter's wedding 7 years ago, back when I still colored my hair auburn and smiled without reservation. According to the carefully crafted words my son-in-law had written, I had passed peacefully on Tuesday evening, surrounded by loving family, after a brave battle with complications from pneumonia. Except I hadn't died. I was very much alive, breathing the aromatic air of ground coffee beans, and listening to indie music play softly through overhead speakers. The obituary had over 3,000 shares within the first hour. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Catherine Brennan, though most people called me Cat throughout my younger years, a nickname that suited my independent nature and tendency to land on my feet, no matter how far I fell. I was born in 1955 in a small mining town in West Virginia, the daughter of a coal worker and a seamstress who believed education was the only ladder out of poverty. They were right. I earned a scholarship to study journalism at Northwestern, became one of the first female investigative reporters at the Chicago Herald in the late 70s, and spent 3 decades uncovering corruption, telling stories that mattered, and occasionally winning awards that gathered dust in my basement. I married Daniel Brennan in 1981, a photojournalist with kind eyes and steady hands who understood my obsession with truth. We had 2 children, Melissa and Christopher, raised them in a suburb where soccer games and school plays punctuated our otherwise chaotic careers. Daniel died of a heart attack in 2018, sudden and devastating, leaving me adrift in a house that echoed with his absence. After Daniel's death, something shifted in my relationships with my children. Melissa, my eldest, had always been ambitious, climbing the corporate ladder at a tech company in Seattle with single-minded determination. She married Trevor, a venture capitalist whose smile never quite reached his eyes, and they produced 2 children who I saw primarily through video calls and carefully curated social media posts. Christopher, my youngest, followed his father into photography but lacked Daniel's integrity. He chased trends instead of stories, building an influencer presence that monetized every moment of his life, including his relationship with his girlfriend Amber, a lifestyle blogger whose existence seemed to revolve around sponsored content and strategic partnerships. After Daniel died, their visits became less frequent, their phone calls shorter, their patience for my stories about the old days noticeably thin. I should have seen it coming. The signs were there if I'd chosen to read them objectively, applying the same critical eye I'd used in my journalism career. 6 months after Daniel's funeral, Melissa began suggesting I downsize, move into something more manageable, perhaps a nice assisted living community where I could socialize with people my own age. Christopher stopped asking about my health and started asking about my estate planning, wondering if I'd updated my will, if I'd considered setting up trusts for his future children, if I'd thought about how to minimize tax burden on inheritance. When I developed pneumonia last winter, a serious case that landed me in the hospital for 10 days, they visited exactly twice between them. Melissa sent flowers with a card signed by her assistant. Christopher posted about his worry on social media, using a throwback photo of us from his childhood, garnering thousands of sympathetic comments from strangers who knew nothing about our actual relationship. I recovered obviously, though it took longer than I would have liked. My lungs were compromised, my energy depleted, and I spent March and April in a rehabilitation facility, relearning how to walk distances without becoming winded. During those months I had time to think, to observe, to recognize patterns I'd been avoiding. The rehab facility was called Mountain View, though it overlooked nothing more scenic than a parking garage. The staff was overworked and underpaid, the food institutional, the activities designed for people who had already given up on life having texture or meaning. I watched other residents shuffle through days that blurred into sameness, their families visiting less and less, their spark dimming with each passing week. I understood, with the clarity that comes from being alone with uncomfortable truths, that this was my children's plan for me. Not immediately, but eventually. Store their mother somewhere convenient, somewhere that required minimal involvement, somewhere she could fade away without disrupting their carefully constructed lives. When I finally returned home in late April, I found my house subtly different. Small things had been moved or removed. A painting Daniel and I had bought in Mexico was gone. His vintage camera collection, which I'd kept displayed in the den, had been packed away. When I asked Melissa about it during one of our stilted video calls, she explained that Trevor thought the cameras might be valuable, that they should be properly stored and eventually sold, that keeping them out was just gathering dust and making me sad. When I mentioned the painting to Christopher, he said Amber had admired it, that he'd borrowed it for a photo shoot, that he'd return it soon. Neither item ever came back. I said nothing, storing the information away like evidence in an investigation, waiting to see what other details would emerge. That's when I started planning. Not revenge exactly, though I won't pretend vindictiveness didn't play a role in my thinking. More accurately, I began constructing a test, an experiment to reveal truth. I'd spent my career exposing lies, and now I turned those skills inward toward my own family. I wanted to know definitively whether my growing suspicions were justified or whether grief and loneliness had warped my perception. I wanted evidence. So I called my doctor Edward Chan, who'd treated me since Daniel and I moved to Portland in the 90s. Edward was more than my physician. He was a friend, someone who'd shared meals at our table, who'd mourned Daniel's death alongside me, who understood complexity and moral ambiguity in ways most people didn't. I explained my plan over coffee at his house, away from the clinical environment of his office. I told him I wanted to stage my death to see how my children would respond, what they would say when they thought I couldn't hear them anymore. Edward listened without interrupting, his expression neutral in that way doctor's perfect, revealing nothing until I'd finished speaking. Then he leaned back in his chair and asked me one question. Are you prepared for whatever answer you find? I thought about it honestly, letting the weight of potential outcomes settle over me. If I was wrong, I would have inflicted unnecessary pain on my children, revealed my own paranoia and distrust, damaged relationships perhaps beyond repair. If I was right, I would have confirmation of a betrayal that would fundamentally alter how I understood my life's most important relationships. Either way, there was no unknowing what I would learn. I told Edward yes. I was prepared. I needed to know. The logistics were surprisingly simple. Edward would file the death certificate, listing complications from pneumonia as the cause. It was plausible given my recent hospitalization, and the medical examiner's office wouldn't question a straightforward case from a trusted physician. I would need to disappear, of course, remove myself from any possibility of accidental discovery. I had a friend, Marion Webb, a former colleague from my journalism days who'd retired to a cabin in rural Washington. Marion understood investigative work, the sometimes murky ethics of pursuing truth, and she offered her guest house without hesitation when I explained what I needed. The plan was to remain dead for 1 week, long enough to observe the immediate aftermath, then resurrect myself in whatever manner seemed appropriate based on what I discovered. Edward would handle the official paperwork, the death certificate and medical records, ensuring everything appeared legitimate. I would monitor events remotely, watching from Marion's cabin as my death played out in real time. We executed the plan on a Tuesday in late September, the kind of gray drizzly day Portland specializes in, where the boundary between sky and earth blurs into uniform dampness. Edward called Melissa and Christopher with the news, his voice appropriately somber as he explained that I'd developed sudden complications, that my compromised lungs had succumbed to infection, that I'd passed quickly with minimal suffering. He'd been with me at the end, he told them, and my final words had been about how much I loved my children. That detail was my addition to the script, a small cruelty perhaps, but I wanted them to carry those words, to see how they'd sit with whatever came next. Within an hour, Melissa had posted a brief statement on social media announcing my passing and requesting privacy for the family. Within 2 hours, Christopher had posted a longer tribute complete with multiple photos spanning our relationship, a carefully curated emotional narrative that his followers consumed eagerly, leaving thousands of comments offering condolences and praising his strength in sharing his grief so openly. The obituary appeared the next morning in the Cascade Tribune, the newspaper where I'd freelanced occasionally in my retirement. My former editor, someone who knew my work but not my current family situation, had been kind enough to publish it prominently. Christopher's husband Trevor had written it, and reading his words was like studying a fiction constructed from fragments of truth. The Catherine Brennan he described was devoted primarily to family, Her journalism career mentioned only briefly, her independence and fierce intellect softened into more palatable grandmotherly warmth. According to Trevor's narrative, I had spent my final years finding joy in simple pleasures, grateful for modern technology that kept me connected to loved ones, at peace with my life's journey. It was a eulogy for someone I barely recognized, a version of myself filtered through their need for me to be someone less complicated, less demanding, less present than I'd actually been. But it was the comments section that truly revealed the landscape I'd been navigating blindly. The obituary had been shared widely, picked up by journalism groups I'd belonged to, circulated among former colleagues and friends from various chapters of my life. Within 24 hours, over 500 comments had accumulated, and I sat in Marion's guest house reading them chronologically.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Watching a counter-narrative emerge that directly contradicted the sanitized version Trevor had constructed. Former sources from investigations I'd conducted decades earlier shared stories of my courage and tenacity. Colleagues described my mentorship and refusal to compromise on ethical standards. Friends from the neighborhood talked about how I'd organized community resistance to a predatory development company, how I'd fought for preservation of local parks, how I'd never lost the instinct to challenge power and protect those with less of it. Then, buried among the genuine tributes, I found comments from my own children, and reading them felt like pressing on a bruise to test its depth. Melissa had written a brief public statement thanking everyone for their support, noting that her mother had lived a full life, and that the family was handling arrangements privately. Perfectly appropriate, perfectly distant, revealing nothing. But Christopher had engaged more extensively, responding to various commenters with messages that made my chest tighten. To someone who'd shared a story about investigating corrupt city officials, he wrote that his mother's work had been important, but that it had often come at the expense of family time, that her career had sometimes felt more important than her children. To a former colleague who'd mentioned my fearlessness, he noted that fearlessness at work sometimes translated to stubbornness at home, an unwillingness to accept help or admit vulnerability. I read those comments multiple times, parsing them for context and subtext in ways I'd once analyzed political speeches and corporate press releases. Christopher was crafting a narrative, I realized, one that positioned him as the dutiful son who tried to care for a difficult mother, who'd been patient with her independence even when it became obstinacy, who'd done his best despite her refusal to make things easier. He was pre-writing the story of why he'd eventually placed me in memory care or a nursing facility, why he'd sold my house and liquidated my possessions, why he'd made decisions on my behalf. He was building justification in real time, using my death as an opportunity to establish a version of events that would shield him from criticism for whatever actions he'd already planned to take. Melissa's approach was different but equally calculated. She joined a Facebook group for people dealing with aging parents, and someone had screenshot her posts there and shared them in a journalist community, where they'd been forwarded to me through a complicated chain I didn't fully understand. In those posts, written under the assumption of privacy among people facing similar challenges, Melissa had described me as increasingly confused after Daniel's death, possibly showing early signs of dementia, certainly not capable of managing my own affairs despite my insistence otherwise. She'd written about the stress of having a parent who refused to acknowledge limitations, who made things difficult by clinging to independence, who didn't understand that accepting help was sometimes the more loving choice. None of it was true. I'd been sharp as ever, passed cognitive assessments with flying colors during my hospital stay, managed my own finances and household with the same competence I'd always had. But Melissa was constructing plausible deniability, creating a narrative framework that would justify whatever steps she intended to take regarding my autonomy and assets. Sitting in Marion's guest house, staring at my laptop screen as rain drummed against the windows, I felt something shift inside me. Not surprise exactly, because some part of me had suspected these currents ran beneath the surface of our interactions. But suspicion and confirmation are different animals, and confirmation carries weight that crushes something in your chest, makes breathing require conscious effort. These were my children, people I'd carried in my body, raised with intention and love, supported through failures and celebrated through successes. These were people who knew my favorite songs and my irrational fear of moths, who'd sat at my table for thousands of meals, who'd cried in my arms over heartbreaks and disappointments. And they were capable of this calculated erosion of my identity, this preemptive justification for control and disposal. I called Edward that evening from Marion's landline, my cell phone powered off and hidden away to prevent location tracking. "I need you to do something else for me," I said without preamble. "I need you to file my will with the county clerk. Make it a matter of public record." Edward was quiet for a moment, understanding immediately what I was really asking. "You want them to know what they stand to inherit." It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. "I want to see what they do when the stakes become clear. Right now they're operating on assumptions. I want to introduce certainty into their calculations." My estate, such as it was, consisted of the house Daniel and I had bought in 1989, now worth approximately $800,000 in Portland's inflated market, my retirement savings of roughly $400,000, Daniel's life insurance payout that I'd barely touched, another $300,000 sitting in conservative investments, and various personal possessions of fluctuating value. Nothing extravagant by modern standards, but a comfortable sum that represented decades of careful financial management and the benefit of buying real estate before prices became astronomical. Daniel and I had been savers, not spenders, practical people who valued security over luxury. We'd planned for retirement, for traveling in our later years, for having enough to never burden our children. The irony of that final goal wasn't lost on me as I instructed Edward to make the will public. In that will, drafted 5 years earlier and never updated despite Daniel's death and my own recent health crisis, I divided everything equally between Melissa and Christopher. Standard, uncomplicated, exactly what they'd expect. But I'd also included specific bequests, items of sentimental value designated for particular recipients. Daniel's camera collection was to go to the photojournalism archive at his alma mater. The painting from Mexico was designated for the Portland Art Museum's Latin American collection. Various other items, pieces they'd already begun to claim or eye with interest, were assigned to institutions, friends, or charities. The monetary value of these individual items was relatively small in the context of the overall estate, but they represented the most personal elements of my life with Daniel, and I'd ensured they wouldn't become commodities in my children's hands. The will became public record on Thursday, 3 days after my supposed death. I monitored social media obsessively, watching for reactions. Christopher found it first, mentioning casually in an Instagram story that estate logistics were more complicated than expected, using the hashtag adulting, as if managing his dead mother's possessions was a relatable life milestone comparable to filing taxes or buying a car. Melissa was more direct, calling Trevor's mother, who then called Edward, asking whether the will could be contested, whether my mental state at the time of drafting could be questioned, whether the bequests to institutions could be redirected given that family should obviously take precedence over strangers. Edward, playing his role perfectly, explained that the will was ironclad, drafted when I was indisputably competent, and that contesting it would be expensive and likely unsuccessful. That's when things got interesting. That's when the comments section on my obituary transformed from a memorial space into something else entirely. A public stage where my children's frustrations and sense of entitlement spilled out for anyone to witness. Christopher posted a lengthy update to his Instagram, one that was quickly screenshot and shared to the obituary comments, in which he discussed the complicated emotions of discovering your parents' final wishes and feeling like you never really knew them. He wrote about feeling betrayed by the will's specific bequests, wondering whether his mother had truly valued family if she'd given away items with sentimental significance to strangers and institutions. He questioned whether her final months of life had been influenced by bitterness or confusion, whether someone should have intervened to help her make more reasonable decisions. Melissa took a different approach, more calculated and legally minded. She posted in an estate planning group about hypothetical scenarios involving wills and mental capacity, thinly veiling the specifics of my actual situation. When people in the group suggested she consult with an elder law attorney, she began making calls, shopping for legal opinions that would support challenging the will's validity. One of those attorneys, perhaps more ethically flexible than most, suggested she might have grounds to argue diminished capacity given my recent hospitalization and the stress of widowhood. I knew this because Edward was contacted by this attorney, who was ethically obligated to inform my executor, which was Edward himself, that the will might face challenge. Meanwhile, the obituary comments had taken on a life of their own, evolving beyond simple condolences into a broader conversation about family, aging, and the complex dynamics of inheritance. Strangers debated whether parents owed their children inheritance, or whether it was a gift to be distributed as the deceased saw fit. Former colleagues weighed in defending my character and mental acuity, pushing back against Christopher's public implications that I might not have been thinking clearly. Someone found and shared an article I'd written years ago about elder abuse, about how families sometimes exploited aging parents, and the irony wasn't lost on the comment section's more astute observers. Sitting in Marion's guest house, I watched this digital drama unfold with a strange detachment, as if observing a story about someone else's family. Marion would check on me periodically, bringing coffee or soup, sitting quietly while I processed what I was witnessing. "You can stop this anytime," she reminded me on the 5th day. "You can come back from the dead, reveal what they've said and done, confront them directly." I knew she was right. I had my answer. I'd confirmed that my children viewed me primarily as an obstacle to inheritance, that they were willing to publicly undermine my character to justify their own frustrations, that they'd never truly seen me as a full person beyond my role as their mother. I had my evidence. The experiment was complete. But something held me back from immediate resurrection, some instinct honed from years of investigative work that suggested the story wasn't finished yet, that more would reveal itself if I remained patient. And I was right. On the 6th day, Christopher and Melissa had a phone conversation that Christopher inadvertently broadcast to his Instagram followers. He'd been doing one of his typical day in the live streaming sessions, his phone propped up while he went about mundane tasks, and he'd forgotten the stream was active when Melissa called. Their conversation lasted 12 minutes before he realized his mistake and ended the stream, but by then, thousands of people had heard them discussing their strategy. They talked about the will, about whether to pursue legal action or accept the distribution and focus on selling the house quickly. Melissa argued for accepting the terms to avoid legal fees and delays. Christopher wanted to fight, convinced that they could demonstrate I'd been influenced or impaired. They discussed my possessions with a casual inventory of people cataloging objects rather than memories, debating which furniture might be valuable enough to sell versus donate, whether my clothing should go to Goodwill or a consignment shop, whether they should hire an estate sale company or handle liquidation themselves. At one point, Christopher actually laughed, while describing how his followers had been so supportive, how his grief content had gained him 15,000 new followers, how tragedy had paradoxically been good for his brand. The internet, as it tends to do, exploded. The stream was recorded and shared widely, making its way to the obituary comments and beyond, spreading through social media like wildfire. People were outraged, horrified by the callousness, the mercenary calculation, the sheer lack of grief in their discussion of their supposedly beloved mother's estate. Journalists, including several people I'd worked with over the years, began covering the story, writing about influencer culture and performative grief, about elder neglect and family dysfunction, about the disconnect between public presentation and private reality. My obituary had gone viral, but not in the way anyone expected. It had become a cultural flashpoint, a referendum on values and authenticity, on what we owe our parents and what parents should expect from their children. Christopher and Melissa went silent on social media, presumably on Trevor's advice. But the damage was done. Their own words, their own carelessness, had revealed exactly who they were when they thought no one important was watching. And I sat in Marion's guest house, reading comment after comment from strangers who'd never met me but who defended my memory with more passion than my own children had shown. People shared stories of their own difficult family dynamics, their own experiences with inheritance disputes and elder neglect. Several people even started investigating me, sharing articles I'd written, awards I'd won, stories I'd broken that had led to actual policy changes and criminal prosecutions. A narrative emerged that positioned me as a woman of principle and courage, whose children had somehow failed to inherit or appreciate those qualities. On the 7th day, Edward called Marion's landline again. "Catherine, you need to see this," he said, and I heard something in his voice that made me set down my coffee with extra care. "Someone has started a GoFundMe campaign. They're raising money to ensure your possessions go to the institutions you designated in your will, to fight any legal challenge your children might mount. It's raised $40,000 in 6 hours." I sat down heavily in Marion's ancient armchair, the springs creaking beneath me. Why? I asked, though the question was rhetorical, directed more at the universe than at Edward. Because your story resonated, he answered simply. Because people are tired of seeing older women erased and dismissed. Because your obituary became bigger than you, became a symbol of something people care about defending. That evening I made my decision. Not about whether to reveal myself, but about how. I could return from the dead privately, confront my children in the privacy of Edward's office or my living room, deal with this as a family matter contained within family boundaries. Or I could make my resurrection as public as my death had been, respond to my own obituary in the same comments section where my character had been debated and defended by strangers. The journalist in me, the part that had always believed in transparency and public accountability, knew which option served truth more effectively. And there was something poetically appropriate about using the same digital tools my children had weaponized against me, about turning their public performance back on them. I spent 2 hours crafting my response, editing and revising with the same care I'd once applied to investigative pieces that would end careers and topple corrupt systems. The comment needed to be clear, factual, devastating, and impossible to misinterpret. It needed to explain without excusing, reveal without descending into vindictiveness, demonstrate the kind of integrity my children had suggested I'd lost. When I finally posted it, using my verified account that the Tribune had maintained for years, the timestamp read 11:47 p.m. on Saturday, exactly 1 week after Edward had pronounced me dead. The comment was simple. Reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated, though not by accident. I staged my passing to understand how my children truly felt about me beyond the performance of filial duty. Their words over this past week, both public and inadvertently broadcast, have provided clarity I needed but didn't want. To those who defended my memory and character, thank you. You understood me better from obituary paragraphs than my children did from decades of relationship. To Christopher and Melissa, I hope you'll use this as an opportunity for genuine reflection, rather than damage control. I'm alive, I'm competent, and I intend to remain very much in control of my own story. The internet predictably lost its collective mind. Within minutes, my comment had thousands of upvotes and replies. News outlets picked up the story immediately, running headlines about the viral obituary and the woman who'd faked her death to expose her children's greed. By morning, I'd received interview requests from major networks, podcasts, and magazines. The GoFundMe campaign doubled its total, with donors adding notes saying they wanted to support my actual life now, not just my hypothetical legacy. Someone created a hashtag, Catherine Brennan Lives, that trended for 2 days. The whole thing spiraled far beyond what I'd anticipated or intended, taking on momentum that felt both validating and overwhelming. Christopher and Melissa called Edward's office within an hour of my comment posting, demanding to speak with me, insisting there had been some terrible misunderstanding. Edward, following my instructions, told them I would reach out when ready, but that attempting to contact me directly would be considered harassment. Melissa sent a lengthy email to the Tribune demanding they remove my comment and issue a retraction of the obituary, threatening legal action for the distress caused by the entire situation. Christopher posted a tearful video apology, claiming he'd been overwhelmed by grief and hadn't meant the things he'd said, that the stream had been taken out of context, that he loved his mother and was simply devastated she'd felt the need to test him this way. The comments on his apology were largely skeptical, people pointing out that you can't take back words that revealed your true character. That grief doesn't excuse mercenary calculation. I stayed at Marion's for another week, letting the chaos settle before planning my actual return. We spent long evenings talking about family, about expectations and disappointments, about the specific loneliness of realizing the people you'd created and raised had become strangers capable of casual cruelty. Marion, who'd never had children, listened without judgment, occasionally offering observations that came from decades of watching human behavior as a journalist. The thing about truth, she said one night, is that once it's exposed, you can't unexpose it. Even if they convinced themselves they were taken out of context or that circumstances made them behave uncharacteristically, you'll always know what they're capable of. That knowledge changes everything. She was right, of course. When I finally returned to Portland, moving back into my house that suddenly felt haunted by evidence of my children's plans for its liquidation, I understood that my relationship with Melissa and Christopher had fundamentally transformed. We couldn't return to the illusion of closeness we'd maintained before, couldn't pretend that nothing had shifted. They'd revealed themselves, and I'd revealed my own capacity for strategic manipulation, for testing their love and finding it wanting. We were all culpable now, all carrying knowledge that made simple family dinners and holiday gatherings impossible in the way they'd once been possible. The memorial service they'd planned for me was quietly canceled, though several friends insisted on gathering anyway, turning it into a celebration of my resurrection rather than a mourning of my loss. It was strange to attend my own not funeral, to accept hugs from people who'd written beautiful things about me in the obituary comments, to see the genuine joy in their faces at discovering I was still alive. One former colleague, a woman named Patricia who'd worked with me on a corruption investigation in the 90s, pulled me aside during the gathering. "I read everything," she said quietly. "Every comment, every response, the whole saga. And I just want to say, as someone who's known you for 30 years, that what you did took the kind of courage most people don't have. You exposed an ugly truth instead of living with a comfortable lie." I appreciated her words, though I wasn't certain courage was the right term for what I'd done. It had been more like self-preservation, the instinct to gather evidence before accepting a narrative that didn't align with my observations. Journalists do this reflexively, constantly testing official stories against available facts, looking for discrepancies that might indicate deeper truth. I'd simply applied those same skills to my personal life, with results that were more devastating precisely because they involved people I'd loved without reservation. The meeting with Melissa and Christopher, when it finally happened 3 weeks after my resurrection, took place in Edward's office with him present as a neutral witness. They'd both prepared statements, carefully worded attempts to explain their behavior without actually accepting responsibility for it. Melissa talked about stress, about the challenges of managing her career while worrying about an aging parent who refused help, about how easy it was to be misunderstood in fragmentary social media posts. Christopher focused on grief, on how losing his father had made him terrified of losing his mother too, on how that fear manifested in unhealthy ways, including focusing on practical matters like estate planning as a way to avoid emotional vulnerability. They were articulate, occasionally tearful, and completely unconvincing. I listened without interrupting, letting them exhaust their prepared remarks before responding. When I finally spoke, I kept my voice level, factual, stripped of accusation or emotion. "I heard what you said when you thought I couldn't hear you anymore. I watched how you discussed my possessions, my character, my competence. Those weren't words spoken in grief or stress. They were words that revealed how you actually think about me, what I represent to you beyond performative family connection. I'm not interested in apologies or explanations designed to manage public perception. I'm interested in whether you're capable of genuine self-examination, of understanding what you did and why it was a betrayal." The silence that followed was heavy, uncomfortable, broken only by Christopher's shifting in his chair and Melissa's careful breathing. Finally, Melissa spoke, and for the first time, I heard something that sounded like honesty beneath the lawyer's precision of her language. "I don't know if I can give you what you want," she said. "I've spent so much time thinking of myself as a good daughter, measuring myself against standards I thought were reasonable, that I don't know how to reconcile that identity with what you saw. Maybe I'm not who I thought I was. Maybe none of us are." It wasn't an apology, but it was a crack in the facade, an acknowledgement that something genuine had been exposed. Christopher was less capable of that kind of vulnerability, still performing even in this private space, but I'd stopped expecting authenticity from him. His entire life was curated for external validation, and that wasn't going to change because his mother had caught him revealing the calculation beneath the performance. We didn't reconcile, not in any meaningful sense. There was no tearful reunion, no promises that everything would be different now. Instead, we established new terms for our relationship, bounded by clear expectations and reduced intimacy. They would visit on designated occasions, but spontaneous drop-ins were over. We would speak regularly, but conversations would stay on safe, surface topics. They would respect my autonomy absolutely, or I would cut contact entirely. These weren't negotiations. They were non-negotiable boundaries established by someone who'd learned the cost of unclear expectations. In the months that followed my resurrection, several unexpected developments occurred. The GoFundMe money, which had ultimately reached nearly $70,000, was redirected at my request to fund a program supporting investigative journalism fellowships for women. The viral nature of my story had created a platform I hadn't sought but decided to use deliberately, writing essays about elder autonomy, family dysfunction, and the performance of grief in social media age. Several publications were interested in serializing a longer account, and I began working on what would eventually become a book documenting the entire experience. Not a memoir exactly, but an investigation into how we treat aging parents in America, using my own story as a case study while incorporating research and interviews with others who'd experienced similar family dynamics. Christopher's influencer career never fully recovered from the scandal. His followers dropped by half, brands withdrew sponsorships, and the authenticity questions raised by his behavior during my supposed death plagued every subsequent post. He eventually pivoted away from lifestyle content into business consulting, using his photography skills and social media experience to help companies develop brand strategies. It was perhaps a better use of his talents anyway, work that didn't require performing intimacy and emotion for public consumption. Melissa's career continued unchanged, her professional life insulated from personal scandal, though I heard through mutual connections that her marriage faced new strains. Questions from Trevor about what other aspects of her life involved the kind of strategic calculation she'd applied to managing her difficult mother. As for me, I discovered that being publicly resurrected created a strange kind of freedom. Having exposed the worst of my family dynamics to public scrutiny, I felt less obligated to maintain appearances, less concerned with protecting reputations or managing perceptions. People knew the messy truth of my relationship with my children, and that knowledge somehow made other relationships clearer, more honest. Old friends reached out, connections I'd let fade after Daniel's death, wanting to reconnect with someone they recognized from my public writing and interviews. I began mentoring young journalists again, something I'd stopped doing during the years I'd been consumed by grief and the slow recognition of my children's emotional distance. The house, my house that Melissa and Christopher had been so eager to liquidate, became mine again in ways it hadn't been since Daniel died. I repainted walls, rearranged furniture, claimed space that had felt like a museum to our marriage rather than a home for my continued living. I adopted a cat, a cranky elderly tabby from the shelter who'd been overlooked for years because people wanted kittens, and naming her Lazarus seemed appropriately ironic. She slept on Daniel's side of the bed, filling a space that had been empty for too long. Edward and I remained close, our friendship deepened by his role in the elaborate deception we'd orchestrated. He never judged my decision to stage my death, understanding it as the kind of investigative impulse that defined my approach to truth-seeking. We had dinner once a month, talking about medicine and journalism, about the ethical complexities both fields navigated, about the loneliness of seeing clearly in a world that often preferred comfortable illusions. He introduced me to his partner, a man named James who worked in bioethics, and the three of us would sometimes spend evenings debating theoretical scenarios involving truth, harm, and the obligations we owe to people who've disappointed us. The comments section on my original obituary remained active far longer than anyone expected, becoming something like an ongoing community discussion about family, aging, inheritance, and authenticity. People would check in periodically, sharing updates about their own situations, asking for advice, offering support to others navigating similar dynamics. I responded occasionally, never using my verified account, just joining the conversation as one voice among many. There was something democratic and hopeful about that space, strangers helping strangers think through complicated family relationships, refusing to accept that difficulty meant impossibility. A year after my resurrection, on the anniversary of my supposed death, I wrote a final comment in that thread. It was long, perhaps longer than appropriate for a comment section, but I wanted to mark the occasion with something that captured what I'd learned. I wrote about the difference between the parent you hope to be and the parent your children actually experience. I wrote about how inheritance can poison relationships years before anyone dies, how the knowledge that your existence stands between your children and financial security creates toxic dynamics, even in families that aren't overtly dysfunctional. I wrote about the importance of boundaries, of recognizing when relationships have become performance rather than connection, of having the courage to acknowledge when the people you love most have become strangers who know your birthday but not your heart. The response to that comment was overwhelming, thousands of replies from people sharing their own anniversary stories, their own moments of recognition and transformation. Several people said my words had given them permission to establish boundaries they'd been afraid to enforce, to prioritize their own well-being over the fantasy of family closeness that had never actually existed. Others thanked me for naming dynamics they'd experienced but couldn't articulate, for providing language that made their own situations feel less isolating. A few criticized me, said I'd been manipulative and cruel, that I'd gotten what I deserved for testing my children in such an elaborate way. I read those comments carefully, considering whether they might be right, whether my actions had been justified, or whether I'd simply traded one form of dysfunction for another. In the end, I decided that both could be true. I could have been justified in seeking truth and simultaneously guilty of manipulation. My children could have been shaped by legitimate concerns and simultaneously revealed profound selfishness. Families are complex systems where everyone is simultaneously victim and perpetrator, where hurt gets passed down and sideways, where the best intentions curdle into the worst outcomes. What mattered wasn't whether I'd been perfect in my investigation, but whether I'd learned something worth the cost of discovery. And I had learned. I'd learned that being loved imperfectly is sometimes worse than not being loved at all, because imperfect love creates constant cognitive dissonance, forces you to reconcile caring actions with casual cruelties, makes you doubt your own perceptions because surely people who love you wouldn't treat you this way. I'd learned that clarity, even painful clarity, is a gift you give yourself when you're brave enough to look directly at uncomfortable truths. I'd learned that the version of yourself that exists in other people's minds is often unrecognizable, that you can spend decades being someone's mother or wife or colleague and still be fundamentally unknown by them, seen only through the narrow aperture of what they need you to be. Most importantly, I'd learned that resurrection is possible, both literal and metaphorical. You can come back from death, from grief, from betrayal, from the slow dissolution of relationships you thought were permanent. You can rebuild yourself in the wake of devastation, using the broken pieces to construct something that better reflects who you actually are rather than who you were expected to be. It's not easy, and the new construction never looks quite like what came before, but it's yours in ways that unconsidered existence never is. My relationship with Melissa and Christopher remained distant but cordial, bounded by the clear terms we'd established in Edward's office. They visited on my birthday and major holidays, calls that felt more like diplomatic summits than family gatherings, everyone carefully avoiding topics that might detonate the fragile peace we'd negotiated. Their children, my grandchildren, knew me primarily through video calls and the stories their parents told them, stories that I suspected positioned me as difficult and eccentric, the grandmother who'd done that weird thing with faking her death. I sent cards and gifts, received polite thank you notes, and tried not to mourn the relationship I'd once imagined having with them. But I also built new forms of family, chosen connections with people who saw and valued the complicated reality of who I was. Marian and I spoke weekly, her friendship a constant reminder that understanding doesn't require shared blood. Edward and James included me in their celebrations, making space at their table for a woman who'd once been married, but was now navigating the world as a single entity. Former colleagues who defended me in the comments section reached out, rekindling professional relationships that evolved into genuine friendship. The young journalists I mentored brought energy and perspective that kept me engaged with work that still mattered. Even Lazarus, in her cranky feline way, provided companionship that asked nothing of me except occasional food and the willingness to share space without demanding performance. On the second anniversary of my supposed death, the Tribune published a follow-up piece, interviewing me about what had changed in the 2 years since my obituary went viral. The journalist, a young woman named Sophia who reminded me of myself at her age, asked whether I regretted the whole thing, whether I wished I'd handled my suspicions differently. I thought about the question seriously, giving it the consideration it deserved. I regret the pain I caused, I said finally. I regret that my children had to experience their mother's death, even briefly, even when it was strategically chosen rather than cosmically imposed. But I don't regret gaining clarity about my life and relationships. Uncomfortable truth is still truth, and living with illusion would have been its own form of suffering. Sophia pushed back gently, as good journalists do. But couldn't you have gained that clarity through direct conversation? Did you need to stage your death to understand how your children felt about you? I considered her question, recognizing the implicit critique. She was right in a theoretical sense. In an ideal world, families would communicate openly, addressing tensions before they calcified into betrayal. But we don't live in an ideal world, and sometimes people only reveal their truth when they think they're safe from consequences, when they believe the person they're discussing can't hear them anymore. Words are easy, I told Sophia. People can say they love you, say they value you, say they want what's best for you while simultaneously taking actions that reveal opposite priorities. I'd heard my children's words for years, reassurances that felt hollow but that I couldn't definitively challenge because words are plausibly deniable. What I needed was evidence of action behavior demonstrated when they thought I couldn't observe. That required removing myself from the equation temporarily. The article Sophia wrote was thoughtful and balanced, presenting multiple perspectives on the ethics of my choice, while also contextualizing it within broader conversations about family dynamics and elder autonomy. It generated another round of viral attention, though smaller than the original wave, and prompted several universities to invite me to speak about investigative ethics, family systems, and the intersection of personal and public truth. I accepted some invitations, declining others, selective about where I directed my limited energy. One speaking engagement stands out in memory: a journalism ethics class at Northwestern, my alma mater, where students who were younger than my grandchildren would be asked me complex questions about deception and truth-telling. One student, a serious young man with careful diction, wanted to know whether I thought my journalistic training had made me approach family relationships differently, whether I'd applied professional skepticism inappropriately to personal connections. It was a smart question, one I'd asked myself repeatedly. Journalism taught me to look for evidence rather than accepting narratives at face value, I answered. That skill is valuable in many contexts, including family relationships where patterns of behavior can reveal dynamics that surface conversation obscures. But you're right that there's something cold about approaching family with investigative distance, about treating people you love as subjects to be studied. The challenge is finding balance between healthy skepticism and corrosive suspicion, between protecting yourself and remaining open to genuine connection. Another student asked whether I'd ever consider reconciling fully with my children, whether enough time might pass that we could rebuild something closer to the relationship we'd had before. I appreciated the optimism implicit in her question, the assumption that damage could always be repaired with sufficient effort. We've reconciled to the degree that feels honest, I said. We're civil, cordial, occasionally warm. But the intimacy is gone, and I'm not sure it was ever as real as I believed it to be. Sometimes the best outcome isn't restoration but transformation into something new that acknowledges rather than ignores what's been broken. That evening, back in my hotel room, I video called Marion, needing to process the day with someone who understood the full complexity of my situation. She listened as I described the students' questions, their mixture of fascination and judgment, their inability to fully grasp how family can contain both profound love and casual cruelty. "You're doing important work," Marion said when I'd finished. "Not just the speaking and writing, but modeling what it looks like to survive family dysfunction without pretending it didn't happen, without accepting a false reconciliation just to ease social awkwardness." Her words comforted me in ways I hadn't expected to need comforting. Living truthfully is exhausting work, requiring constant vigilance against the social pressure to smooth over difficulties, to accept inadequate apologies, to prioritize other people's comfort over your own integrity. Having witnesses who understood and validated that work made it feel less isolating, less like stubborn refusal to move on and more like principled commitment to living authentically. Now, 3 years after my obituary went viral, I've settled into a life that looks nothing like what I'd imagined during those years of marriage and active parenting. I write regularly, both journalism and more personal essays, maintaining the work that's always defined me. I teach occasionally, sharing skills with younger generations while learning from their fresh perspectives. I travel more than I did when Daniel was alive, finally taking trips we'd always planned but postponed, discovering that solo travel has its own satisfactions. I've learned to be alone without being lonely, to find sufficiency in my own company supplemented by chosen connections rather than obligatory family ties. Melissa and Christopher remain peripheral figures in my life, present but not central, known but not intimate. I've stopped expecting transformation from them, Stopped hoping they'll suddenly develop insight into their own behaviors or genuine remorse for their actions. They are who they are, shaped by forces I only partially understand, capable of both kindness and cruelty in ways that probably baffle them as much as they baffle me. I hope they're happy or at least content in whatever lives they're building. I hope they've learned something from the entire experience, though I suspect the lessons they took differ significantly from the ones I hoped they'd learn. What I know for certain is that writing my own obituary, however accidentally and posthumously, was strangely clarifying. Reading how people understood my life, what they valued about my work and character, what they remembered years or decades after our paths crossed helped me understand my own legacy more clearly than I'd been able to while consumed by family dynamics and daily disappointments. The obituary comments section became a mirror reflecting back a version of myself I'd almost forgotten existed. The Catherine who'd fought corruption and told difficult truths and never accepted convenient lies as substitute for uncomfortable reality. That Catherine, the one strangers saw clearly while my own children couldn't or wouldn't see, is who I've recommitted to being in whatever years remain. Not the difficult mother, not the inconvenient aging woman, not the obstacle between my children and inheritance, but the investigator, the truth-teller, the person who looks directly at things others prefer to ignore. It's not always a comfortable identity, and it's cost me relationships I'd hoped to preserve, but it's authentic in ways that performance and accommodation never were. If there's wisdom I've gained that might benefit others navigating similar territory, it's simply this. Believe people when they show you who they are, especially when they think you're not watching. Don't torture yourself trying to reconcile loving words with unkind actions. Don't exhaust yourself constructing explanations for behavior that speaks clearly for itself. And when you've gathered sufficient evidence that a relationship isn't what you thought it was, be brave enough to adjust your expectations accordingly, to build boundaries that protect your dignity even if they reduce your connection. The comments section on my original obituary still exists, an archived conversation that new people discover periodically, adding their own observations years after the original events. I check it occasionally, reading through the accumulated wisdom and speculation, the theories about family dysfunction and elder autonomy, the personal stories from people who saw themselves reflected in my experience. It's become something like a digital monument, not to my death but to the moment I chose to investigate my own life with the same rigor I'd once applied to exposing corruption and injustice. And sometimes, late at night when Lazarus is asleep on Daniel's pillow, and the house is quiet except for Portland rain against the windows, I'll add a new comment to that thread. Nothing dramatic, just observations about aging and family, and the strange journey of becoming someone you didn't expect to be. Small contributions to an ongoing conversation about what we owe each other, what we owe ourselves, and how to navigate the gap between the two when they come into conflict. My obituary went viral. The comments section got interesting when I responded. And somewhere in that digital chaos, I found a version of myself worth resurrecting, worth fighting for, worth building a life around even when that life looked nothing like the one I'd planned. If that's not a happy ending, it's at least an honest one, and honesty I've learned is its own form of grace. The morning after I posted my resurrection comment, I woke to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. My phone had been silenced, tucked away in Marion's kitchen drawer, while I slept fitfully in the guest bedroom that had become my sanctuary. The rain had stopped sometime during the night, leaving behind that peculiar clarity Pacific Northwest mornings sometimes offer, everything washed clean and sharp-edged. I made coffee in Marion's ancient percolator, the kind that gurgles and hisses like a living thing, and only then did I retrieve my phone to survey the damage. The messages fell into predictable categories. Journalists requesting interviews, old colleagues expressing shock and support, acquaintances who'd never been particularly close suddenly desperate to reconnect with someone momentarily famous. Buried among the professional inquiries and casual opportunism were 3 messages from Melissa, each more desperate than the last, and a voicemail from Christopher that I couldn't bring myself to play. Edward had texted simply asking if I was safe, and reminding me that I didn't owe anyone immediate responses. His steadiness anchored me as I scrolled through the chaos my single comment had unleashed. Marion appeared in the kitchen doorway, her gray hair uncombed, wearing a flannel robe that had seen better decades. She poured herself coffee without speaking, a comfortable silence we'd perfected over the week I'd spent hiding in her guest house. Finally, she said what we both knew needed saying. "You can't stay here forever." At some point you have to go back and face whatever comes next. I nodded, knowing she was right but not yet ready to translate that knowledge into action. Returning to Portland meant confronting my children, dealing with the media attention, reclaiming a life that would never again resemble the quiet existence I'd maintained before staging my death. "Give me one more day," I said, and Marion nodded without judgment. We spent that day like we'd spent the previous ones, reading and talking and occasionally walking the property Marion had bought decades ago specifically for its isolation. She'd been married once, briefly, to a man who couldn't tolerate her commitment to work that took her into dangerous situations. No children, no remaining family, just a career that had consumed her 20s and 30s before she'd chosen this deliberate solitude. Looking at her life, I wondered if that path might have been easier, cleaner, less tangled in obligations and disappointments that came from creating people who would eventually see you as inconvenient. But dwelling on alternate histories was pointless indulgence. I'd made the choices that led here, married Daniel and raised children and built a life that had contained both profound joy and equally profound betrayal. You couldn't extract one without losing the other, couldn't cherry-pick experiences and discard the painful ones while keeping the beautiful moments intact. The whole messy package was my life, and returning to Portland meant accepting responsibility for all of it, including the elaborate deception I'd orchestrated to expose my children's true feelings. I returned on a Wednesday, driving my own car that Edward had retrieved from my house and delivered to Marion's property. The journey took 4 hours, winding through mountains and forests before descending into the urban sprawl where I'd lived for decades. My neighborhood looked unchanged, the same carefully maintained craftsman houses and mature trees that had been selling points when Daniel and I first bought here. But I saw it differently now, aware that neighbors had read my obituary, watched the subsequent drama unfold online, formed opinions about my family and my choices that would color every future interaction. Edward met me at the house, having aired it out and stocked the refrigerator with essentials. He'd also installed a new security system, explaining that my sudden fame had attracted not just journalists but also strangers with concerning fixations, people who'd constructed elaborate narratives about what my story meant and wanted to involve themselves in the ongoing drama. The thought of needing protection in my own home was surreal, another consequence I hadn't fully anticipated when planning my resurrection. "They're waiting for you to contact them," Edward said, meaning Melissa and Christopher. "I've told them you need space, but they're persistent. Melissa has threatened legal action, though I'm not sure on what grounds. Christopher keeps showing up at my office, trying to convince me to facilitate a meeting." I appreciated Edward's role as buffer, but knew it couldn't continue indefinitely. Eventually, I would have to face my children directly, sit across from them and acknowledge the wreckage of our relationship without flinching from my own culpability in creating that wreckage. "Set something up for next week," I told him. "Neutral location, your office probably, with you present as witness. I'll see them together, hear whatever they need to say, and then we'll establish boundaries going forward." Edward made notes in his careful physician's handwriting, creating a framework for a conversation that would fundamentally reshape what remained of my family. After he left, I walked through my house room by room, reacquainting myself with space that felt both familiar and foreign, marked by my children's subtle violations during my supposed death. The painting from Mexico was still missing, as was Daniel's camera collection. New absences revealed themselves as I inventoried more carefully. A first edition book Daniel had treasured gone. My grandmother's silver candlesticks vanished. Small valuable items that could be easily transported and sold, taken by children who'd believed their mother was beyond caring about material possessions. I documented each missing piece methodically, photographing empty spaces and making detailed lists, the journalist in me gathering evidence even though I had no intention of pursuing theft charges against my own children. That evening I began responding to interview requests, selective about which outlets I trusted to handle the story with appropriate nuance. I agreed to speak with a public radio journalist who specialized in family dynamics, declined a morning show that wanted to ambush me with surprise reunions, accepted a written interview with a magazine focused on aging and elder rights. Each conversation required me to articulate what I'd done and why, to defend choices that many people found manipulative and cruel, while others celebrated as justified exposure of toxic family patterns. The radio interview aired 3 days later, a thoughtful hour-long conversation about family expectations, inheritance dynamics, and the specific invisibility that often accompanies aging. The journalist, a woman named Teresa who'd cared for her own declining parents, asked questions that pushed beyond surface sensationalism into deeper territory about autonomy and dignity. "What did you hope to accomplish?" she asked at one point. "Was it about punishing your children or protecting yourself?" I'd considered this question extensively during my week at Marion's, examining my motivations with the same ruthlessness I'd once applied to investigating corruption. "Both," I admitted. I wanted them to face consequences for how they'd treated me, but I also needed to protect myself from further erosion of my autonomy and dignity. They were building a narrative that positioned me as incompetent, laying groundwork to eventually make decisions on my behalf. Exposing their actual motivations while I was still clearly competent was self-preservation as much as punishment. Teresa followed up gently but persistently. "Some listeners might argue that all families have complicated dynamics, that your children's concerns about your well-being after your husband's death and serious illness were legitimate, even if imperfectly expressed. How do you distinguish between imperfect care and actual betrayal?" It was a fair challenge, one that forced me to articulate distinctions I felt intuitively but hadn't fully verbalized. "Imperfect care involves good intentions poorly executed," I said slowly, working through the logic as I spoke. "It's calling too infrequently because work is overwhelming, or suggesting assisted living because you genuinely believe it would improve your parents' quality of life. Betrayal involves prioritizing your own interests while performing concern, removing valuable items from your supposedly beloved mother's house while she's hospitalized, discussing her estate with more enthusiasm than you discuss her actual well-being. The distinction lies in whether the parent is seen as a full person or as an obstacle to be managed." The interview generated significant response, listeners calling in to share their own experiences with family dysfunction and inheritance disputes. Many expressed gratitude for my willingness to name dynamics they'd experienced, but felt unable to discuss publicly. Others criticized my approach, argued that I damaged my children unnecessarily, suggested that forgiveness and grace would have been more appropriate responses than exposure and confrontation. I read all the feedback carefully, considering criticisms that might contain legitimate challenges to my choices. The meeting with Melissa and Christopher took place the following Tuesday in Edward's office, a space deliberately chosen for its clinical neutrality. They arrived separately, Melissa first with Trevor trailing reluctantly behind her, then Christopher alone looking haggard in ways that social media filters usually concealed. Edward ushered us all into his conference room, offering coffee that no one wanted, creating small rituals of normalcy before we addressed the central rupture in our family. Melissa spoke first, her banker's composure firmly in place despite the tremor in her hands. "What you did was cruel and manipulative. You made us mourn you, experience genuine grief, only to reveal it was a test we'd failed. That's abuse, Mom. That's using your power as a parent to inflict maximum emotional damage." Her words were prepared, rehearsed, probably reviewed by Trevor's legal contacts. They weren't wrong exactly, but they were incomplete, focusing on my actions while ignoring the context that had prompted them. Christopher's approach was different, more emotional and less structured. He cried, actual tears that might have been genuine or might have been performance. He'd become so skilled at manufacturing emotion for camera. "I don't understand why you didn't just talk to us," he said. "If you felt disrespected or undervalued, why not say something instead of staging this elaborate scheme? We could have worked through it as a family." I let them speak uninterrupted, allowing them to articulate their grievances and hurt feelings, to position themselves as victims of my manipulation, rather than perpetrators of their own betrayals. When they'd exhausted their prepared statements, I responded with the same measured calm I'd maintained throughout the entire situation. "You're asking why I didn't talk to you directly about my concerns. I did. Multiple times. When you suggested I downsize immediately after your father's death, I explained that I wasn't ready to leave our home. When you asked about my estate planning and suggested trust structures that would benefit you, I told you clearly that I would handle my own affairs. When I asked about missing items from the house, you gave vague explanations and promises to return things that never materialized. I communicated. You didn't listen because my words interfered with plans you'd already made." Melissa started to interrupt, but Edward raised a hand, reminding her that we'd agreed to let each person speak fully before responding. I continued, keeping my voice level despite the anger that still simmered beneath my apparent calm. What I discovered by staging my death wasn't new information about your feelings toward me. It was confirmation of what I'd already suspected but couldn't definitively prove. You revealed yourselves when you thought I couldn't hear you anymore. And those revelations were consistent with behavior patterns I'd been observing for years. The elaborate scheme, as Christopher calls it, wasn't about creating a problem. It was about exposing one that already existed. The silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken accusations and defensive justifications. Finally, Trevor spoke, his venture capitalist precision cutting through the emotional thickness. So where does this leave us? What outcome are you seeking from this meeting? It was a practical question, perhaps the only practical question that mattered at this point. Honesty, I said simply. I'm not interested in pretending we have a close relationship we don't actually have. I'm not interested in obligatory visits and performative affection. What I want is clear boundaries, minimal contact that doesn't require either of us to pretend feelings we don't have, and absolute respect for my autonomy in all matters concerning my life and estate. You'll inherit eventually, but you'll do so on my timeline and according to my terms, without input or negotiation. Christopher looked devastated. Whether genuinely or performatively, I couldn't determine anymore. Melissa looked calculating, already mentally adjusting to this new framework and determining how to work within its constraints. We spent another hour hammering out specific terms, Edward taking notes that would eventually become a formal agreement, outlining the limited scope of our future relationship. It wasn't reconciliation, but it was resolution of a sort, an acknowledgement that some breaks are too fundamental to repair. Leaving Edward's office that afternoon, walking to my car through Portland drizzle that had resumed its customary presence, I felt something release in my chest. Not relief exactly, but a sense of completion, of having said what needed saying and established boundaries that would protect whatever peace I could construct in my remaining years. My children receded in my rearview mirror, literally and metaphorically, becoming smaller as I drove toward a life that would prioritize my own well-being over their expectations. The house I returned to that evening felt more mine than it had since Daniel's death, reclaimed not just from my children's plans but from the ghost of our marriage that had haunted every room. I began making changes that week, small alterations that marked the space as belonging to Catherine alone rather than to Catherine and Daniel or Catherine the mother. I painted the bedroom a color Daniel would have hated. I converted his study into a workspace for my writing, donating his books to the library, and replacing his heavy furniture with pieces that suited my preferences. I hung new artwork that reflected my taste, rather than our compromised couple's aesthetic. Lazarus the cat settled in quickly, her cranky presence filling the house in ways that felt appropriate. She had no patience for sentimentality, demanded what she needed without apology, existed on her own terms regardless of human expectations. I found her self-sufficiency aspirational, a model for how I wanted to navigate my own remaining years. The viral attention gradually faded, as internet phenomena inevitably do, replaced by newer scandals and more current outrage. My story became reference material, something people mention when discussing family dysfunction or elder autonomy, but no longer the immediate focus of widespread attention. This suited me perfectly. I'd never sought fame, only clarity, and having achieved that clarity I was content to return to relative obscurity. Life settled into new patterns, rhythms built around work and chosen connections, rather than obligatory family maintenance. I wrote more prolifically than I had in years, essays and articles that drew on my experience, but expanded into broader analysis of social systems and cultural assumptions. I traveled to places Daniel and I had discussed but never prioritized, discovering that solo travel offered its own satisfactions when freed from the need to accommodate someone else's preferences and pace. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.